Good afternoon, everybody. I was, I think, assigned a 20-minute slot, and I'll be finishing up now in 2 minutes, I would say. In any case, as you can see, thank you, Christopher. As you can see, I'm here to say a few words about my book, my new book, and it's a privilege indeed to be here and to have that opportunity. The book, as you know, and is certainly as many of you have it in your possession at this stage, is called Anglicizing Tudor Connacht, the expansion of English rule in the lordships of Clanrickard and Hy Many. Clanrickard was ruled by the de Burgh dynasty, while Hy Many was governed by the Gaelic Irish or Kelly clan. So before I start, I want to just say thank you very much. Gormila Mahagot to Antusal Garojo Kelly, Cahirlik Finchna Hearn, who invited me to, early on in this year indeed, to come here and present the book today. Also, I want to thank Miss Kieran O'Dowd, Honorary Treasurer of Clans of Ireland, for liaising with Zoe, who's selling the books on behalf of Forecourt Press earlier on there, and for making all the necessary arrangements for this to happen. And finally, I want to thank all of you here who have today purchased a copy of the book, or indeed may at some other time purchase a copy, or indeed are sufficiently interested in the contents of the book to actually hang around in spite of all the technical difficulties and stay here to hear this short presentation, as I promise it's going to be. So what's the book all about? Well, the title indeed tells it. It's in essence about the Anglicization of Connacht in the 16th century, focusing on two lordships in East Galway and South Roscommon, the Lordship of Clanrickard and the Lordship of Hy Many. Now, while the focus in the book is on those two lordships, the socially modifying changes, if you like, that were taking place during the Tudor period affected all the political communities right throughout Connacht. So it has a relevance not just for East Galway or South Roscommon, but for all of Connacht and even beyond that. The map that you see on the front of the book is a very important part of the publication. As they say, and you all know this for many years, a picture paints 1,000 words. This picture was painted in 1567, more or less in the middle of the Tudor period. And what it tells us here is vitally important. It is better than a lot of documents that you can actually look up from the period itself. This is the original map, drawn by John Gough, 1567. And notice that it is Ireland, representing the country as it was known at that particular time. But I want to draw your attention to the shading of part of the country, and that is the province of Connacht. You'll notice that it is somewhat darker than the rest of the country. Now, when I was doing my research for this, when I came across this map, I said, that's exactly what I'm looking for. A map that makes Connacht stand out, which is what I was dealing with. So that's the section, that's the detail that was used on the front cover of the book. So it was also interesting to note that the Earl of Clanrickard was noted in central East Galway, which is more or less where the lordship existed at the time, and also the O'Kellys, who were close by. But I want to remark on one other group of people, and I spoke to John Farrell about this earlier. John and I had a little chat about it. That shaded area included the O'Farrell country in Annally and also the O'Reilly territory of East Breffni, because in 1567, and before that indeed, these territories were considered part of Connacht. And John also pointed out to me that as late as 1610, they are still included in Connacht. Now, in theory, they shouldn't have been, because in 1569, 1570, when the sharing of Connacht took place, the commissioners were advised not to include the territory of Annally, which was formed into the county of Longford later, and the territory of East Breffni, O'Reilly territory, because that was later shired as County Callan. Looking at this map here from a book 1995 by Professor Stephen Ellis of University College Galway. It's titled Gaelic and English Lordships in Ireland 1534 with Prominent English Marshal. Now, the shaded areas are the areas that were under English lordship at that particular time. We're all very familiar with this portion of the country here around about Dublin, or to the west of Dublin, known generally as the English Pale, and right across the south of Connacht as well, or sorry, the south of Ireland, in Munster, you have descendants of the Anglo-Norman settlers from the 12th century. While they wouldn't have been, as we'll say, obedient or as closely connected with the crown as the people in the English Pale, nevertheless, they were living to a large degree in English way of life. But what is rarely mentioned is that there was a little pale in the west of Ireland, east of Galway Bay, between the towns of Galway and Athenry, both of which were Anglo-Norman settlements in the 13th century. And that was of vital importance when it came to the Anglicization of Connacht in the 16th century. This close-up of the map shows Clanrickard and that particular area right in the middle of the territory of Clanrickard itself. And if you have a look, you can see all the English and Irish lordships scattered here throughout Connacht. The other one that's most interesting for us here, of course, is the O'Kellys of Hy Many, which joined Clanrickard country to the east. This is a map of Galway, modern-day baronage marked in. Clanrickard consisted of 6 baronies: Clare, Athenry, Dunkellen, Kiltartan, Loughrea, and Leitrim, whereas there were 7 baronies in Hy Many, 4 of which were in County Galway, to the west of the Suck River, and 3 in Roscommon, at the Sloan North, the Sloan South, and Mycarn, while the baronies in Galway were Tyquin, Kilconnell, Killine, and Clonmacnown. So that just gives you the background, the geographical background, if you like, for the setting of the book, if you like. So moving on, then the layout of the book and the contents. Very briefly, I'll go through it. It's divided into 5 thematic chapters with subheadings here and there at appropriate points to help the reader see what is coming down the line. Chapter 1 examines the English foundations of early Tudor policy in Connacht, focusing on the Anglo-Norman conquest and colonization of the western region in the 13th century, which took place after this major incursion by Richard de Burgh and his allies into Connacht in 1235. The events of this period determined the geographical extent of the work and the O'Kelly lordships, and it also triggered a long-lasting antagonistic relationship between the ruling dynasties of the Burkes and the O'Kellys. It could be judiciously described as a hostile two-nation legacy of the Middle Ages. Now, I briefly mentioned this question of the two-legacy or the two-nation theory. It was like a hot potato back in the end of the last century. There was one group who believed that, no, the Anglo-Normans had become more Irish than the Irish themselves. And by the way, Michael misquoted me there. In any case, we'll see later that that might not be the case. And then, of course, on the other hand, you had the Gaelic Irish. So the belief was that the Anglo-Normans, particularly the Burkes here in this in South Connacht, that they had become more Irish than the Irish themselves, that they had adopted Irish ways of life, the Irish language, and indeed Irish names. 300 years later, this is how the relationship between the Burkes and the O'Kellys is described. The Burkes that be of English nation beareth mortal hate to the Kellys. And I'm sure that was reciprocated. This is how the Master of Rolls, Robert Cowley, described the relationship between the Clanrickard Burkes and the O'Kellys of Hy Many in a treatise that he drew up in 1536 for the proposed Reformation of Ireland. So this is 300 years after the initial confrontation and conquest, if you like, of Connacht. So this antagonistic relationship that was born back in 1235 and afterwards continued on. It manifested itself right throughout the Middle Ages, as the annals will, an examination of the annals will show. It also was there at the beginning of the 16th century. In 1504, for example, there was a major battle fought in Knockdoe. And there, the Burke and the O'Kellys were on either side, with great loss of life to all concerned. I'm not going to go into any detail there except to say the antagonistic relationship continued. Moving forward into the 1530s, with the Kildare revolt, the Kildare rebellion, the Burkes attacked the O'Kellys purposely, probably at the instigation of the Earl of Ormond at the time, so that they would be occupied, defending themselves, and could not go to aid their traditional Fitzgerald allies at this time. Our chapter 1 also focuses on the royal boroughs of Galway and Athenry. The towns and their hinterlands were of crucial significance when it came to the Anglicization of Connacht from the 1540s onwards. I mentioned that already to you. It was like a launching pad for the English crown. They had here two towns that were English-speaking. They used the English dress, and they lived, for the most part, according to English common law. So it was a wonderful base, if you like, for the crown to expand from. The residents of these long-established English-style boroughs were considered models of English civility. The towns would have been formed shortly after the conquest of Connacht in 1235. Now, the people of the neighbourhood were expected, the neighbouring lordships were expected that perhaps they could emulate their dress, their way of life, and so forth. So there were examples that were being held up. Now, central to the process of Anglicization, of course, was the assertion of royal authority. The first example that we have of that really is in 1538, when Ulick Nigan Burke and other Connacht lords submitted to the then Lord Deputy, a man by the name of Lord Leonard Gray. Now, Ulick Burke's submission was voluntary. He did it of his own volition in order to gain lordship over his own kinsmen. And this led eventually, some 5 years later, to his ennoblement to the status of Earl by Henry VIII. So this is a sure sign that Anglicization is taking place. The O'Kellys were also involved in the surrender and regrant in the early 1540s. West of the Sook, in particular, Abbot A. O'Kelly, he submitted and he surrendered the well-known and very well endowed Abbey of Knockmoy in 1542. The Burke and O'Kelly surrender and regrant agreements are most interesting when they're studied, because it shows again that this two-nation theory was a reality even at that particular time. The Crown looked upon these as two separate groups. One, descendants of the Anglo-Normans, who were expected to promote Anglicization in their lordship, and then on the other hand, you had the O'Kellys. All they were expected to do was provide military assistance and some supplies and so forth for the Lord Deputy when he was in the area. So they are being treated as two different nationalities. Now, moving on to chapter 3, it assesses the Crown's commitment to support newly confirmed subjects in Ireland, such as the Burkes of Clanrickard. In particular, the second Earl, that's Richard Sassenach. He had difficulty maintaining his authority in the lordship after he was installed there in 1551 by the Crown. The growth of Tudor power and influence in Hy Many is also discussed in chapter 3, as are the proposed programmes for the political and social reform of Ireland as a whole, and of Connacht in particular. Now, I mentioned earlier on there that this Cowley gentleman, the Master of the Rolls, he was drawing up, as many others did at the time, a programme for the reform, the political reform, that is, of Ireland. Well, it continues. And part of these reform programmes are included in that was the introduction of English-style government and English-style, that's regional and local government. And that was introduced gradually, piecemeal, during the reign of Elizabeth I. But the greatest impact was made in 1569, when the presidency of Connacht was established. And at the time, you also had the shiring of Connacht. The province of Connacht was divided into counties. That's all dealt with in chapter 4. It marked the and it resulted in widespread discontent right throughout the province of Connacht, not just in South Connacht, but right throughout the province. And the Earl of Clanrickard's sons, John and Ulick, rebelled on 3 separate occasions throughout the following decade. That's the 1570s. The reason for their revolts really was not the fact that Anglicization was being introduced into their lordship. It was more because of the individuals that were involved in the process. So that and the policies that were being pursued. The Lord Deputy at the time was Sir Henry Sidney, and he had a fundamental but clearly a really flawed objective, and that was to undermine the authority of the Earl among his own kinsmen and in his countryside. Now, the Earl was an agent of Anglicization of immense value, but he didn't seem to see that. He went and he chose a gentleman by the name of John Burke from a hostile collateral branch of the Burkes to act as Sheriff of County Galway. Now, as Sheriff of County Galway, he had authority, administrative authority, to operate within the barony of Longford, of Loughrea, and that, of course, was the Earl of Clanrickard's territory, and this caused immense problems. So, cooperation with and support for the Crown's representatives had been the hallmark of Richard Sassenach's reign for the previous 2 decades or so, since he was installed in 1551, but that all changed. And because of the official favour that was being shown to John Burke, his archenemy, the antithesis was the norm after that. However, the Earl consistently professed his loyalty, and he never actually went into active rebellion against the Crown, although he did have various difficulties with them later. This is just a taster, as you can well imagine. Now, also addressed in chapter 4 is the response of the O'Kellys during the 1570s, a very tumultuous period when there were 3 revolts or rebellions by the Earl of Clanrickard's sons. They remained peaceful. They didn't get involved in what was going on at all. And they were rewarded later on in the decade, in the late 1570s, by being appointed as agents of the Crown, both locally in County Galway and indeed at a provincial level as well. Moving on to chapter 5, it looks at the manifestation of English rule in Clanrickard and Hy Many in the decades following the establishment of the Connacht presidency. Now, in this context, the functioning of the newly created County of Galway after 1569 is examined in detail. Also, the 2 composition agreements that were drawn up. In 1577, Sir Henry Sidney was responsible for introducing the first composition of Connacht, which was basically a taxation scheme that was going to be used to support the presidency of Connacht. In 1585, Sir John Perrott, who was then the Lord Deputy, he introduced a much more elaborate scheme. It was, again, meant to be a taxation system that would support the presidency, but it also had socially modifying aspects, such as the surrender of the Gaelic titles, and, as well as that, the adoption of English common law in place of Brehon law. So Gaelic society was coming to an end, if you like, at this stage. It was, if you like, a sounding of the death knell that was to come. Now, furthermore, in that chapter, land ownership changes that resulted from the Anglicizing influence and socio-economic impact of the presidency in both Clanrickard and Hy Many are discussed. And finally, the contrasting relations of the Burkes and the O'Kellys with the Crown in the lead up to the 9 Years' War are considered against the backdrop of mounting royal expectations for both groups. And all I'd say on that is that this is following on from the rebellions of the Earl of Clanrickard's sons in the 1570s, while the Burkes or while the O'Kellys were calm. And here we are on the eve of the 9 Years' War. A new earl has been installed as one of the rebels, actually, has been installed in 1582, and he turns out to be a model, an absolute model. So the Burkes are doing everything right at the beginning of the 9 Years' War, and the O'Kellys are beginning to rebel in various parts in Galway and indeed in Roscommon. So in conclusion, the findings of this book question the validity of this much quoted phrase, more Irish than the Irish themselves, and endorse the view that two distinct races coexisted in Ireland in the later Middle Ages. This is why I was saying Michael misquoted me, really. So I'm going to finish up by reading the blurb which is printed on the back of the book, because it succinctly sums up its content. At the beginning of the 16th century, the South Connacht lordships of Clanrickard and Hy Many lay beyond the effective control of the Tudor government. Clanrickard was ruled by the Burke dynasty, descendants of the 13th century Anglo-Norman conquerors and colonists of Connacht, while Hy Many was governed by the indigenous Gaelic Irish O'Kelly lords. This book charts the episodic expansion of English rule into the lordships while taking cognizance of major government initiatives such as the surrender and regrant programme of the 1540s, the establishment of the Connacht Presidency in 1569, and the composition of Connacht in 1585. The difficulties experienced by the historically hostile political communities of Clanrickard and Hy Many as they endeavoured to accommodate the expanding Tudor state are analysed and discussed, as are the consequent changes in the political, social and economic fabric of the province of Connacht. And with that, I give you my latest book, Anglicizing Tudor Connacht, The Expansion of English Rule in the Lordships of Clanrickard and Hy Many. Thank you very much.